Okay, I like to talk about split face block or cinder block as it's referred to, concrete block. Basically all means the same thing. And the issue is why in the Midwest they are prone to leakage. One of the things about split face block, concrete block, is that they're very porous. They're inexpensive for construction for both labor and material costs compared to brick or other types of siding, if any. And it also can be used for structural as long as you know how to reinforcement from the interior cells. The problem with split face, since it absorbs water, and particularly when we're in the winter month or even in the spring when we're still getting cold temperatures, it's around 40 degrees, drizzles, and then all of a sudden the temperature starts to drop, and it could drop easily below 32. At that point, water freezes, as we all know. Well, the moment that does, the water inside that freezes basically expands. And as it expands, it creates cracks in the split face. Slowly, in time, those cracks get larger and larger after a few years, and that's when you have water leakage problems. One of the ways to avoid and manage the water infiltration problems on split face block, concrete block, is basically apply a sealer. Make sure that an industrial type, heavy duty, and it's properly installed. In other words, be careful because some of them say you can spray them. Other times they say you have to roll it with a painter's roller. The hairs in the roller. It has to be a certain thickness system. There's others that you can use spraying. I wouldn't recommend spraying because if it's a day that's a bit windy, much of that sealer gets airborne and basically it's not properly applied onto the wall itself, the exterior wall. By applying it properly, selecting the correct one, making sure you're also working with an experienced contractor or an architect or both. In my case, I'm both an architect and a contractor. They understand the process of the installations of these sealers. The joints themselves around the block wall, make sure that they don't have large cracks because the paint doesn't bridge very easily over a large crack. They have to be hairline cracks in order to work properly. The product can then bridge. The other items you need to look and inspect and have investigated is basically the flashing around the window themselves and also the lintel. Typically windows don't generally leak if it's a window that's 10 to 15 years old. Be very careful when you point out to a contractor if it's a window issue. They will make an assumption that's a window problem. Most likely it's a flashing problem. Could be from the lintel above or from the perimeter around the windows. The other thing is to inspect the flashing around the perimeter of the lintel and make sure that they have end dams. As I point out over here, identifying what an end dam is, basically it's just getting the flashing to come from the bottom of the lintel and then come back up and stop. The idea is that when water is flowing on that piece of flashing of the lintel, it has a place to stop and it comes out. Include the weep vents. I prefer using weep vents versus the weep openings or the holes or the wick that they sometimes use because they do get clogged up with mortar when the mortar is being installed around the perimeter of the block wall. The other things you want to inspect is the top of the parapet of a flat roof, in this case if it's a split face block. The top of the parapet is that piece of the wall that extends above the roof line on the edge of the perimeter of the building. You want to make sure to inspect the parapet wall itself. That's that wall that extends above the roof. And you want to make sure you inspect not just the wall itself, but you also want to inspect the top of it, and we call that the coping cover. Make sure that if it's metal, that all the penetrations along that metal is sealed, meaning that it's caulked. Make sure that it's not brittle because sealant has an approximately age between 15 years plus or minus, depending on how severe the weather is in this particular area of the country. It becomes brittle, and as it becomes brittle, it's not expanding and contracting with the movement of the temperature changes. You also want to inspect the interior of the parapet wall and make sure that ideally you have a riglet. The riglet is the shape of the flat metal flashing that comes in this shape like an L. The idea is that it stops water from coming in, as opposed to when they do what we call flush termination. And basically it's a termination bar, the roof membrane underneath, and then they sealed or they caulk the top of it. That's okay, but it doesn't have the same longevity as a riglet. Other construction materials that leak are also brick and mortar joints, particularly the older buildings, because they've been weathered throughout the years, throughout 20 years, 30 years, even 50 years down and older than that. You need to make sure that the tuck pointing is basically sufficient and it's properly installed, meaning when they grind the brick joint themselves, you also use the correct type of mortar. One of the issues with brick and leakage and water infiltration infiltration is basically, it comes down to the mortar type in most cases. The issue is that there are several types of mortar. You actually would prefer to work with the old type for the old mortar itself because that's a softer mortar than the N as in Nancy and O as in Oscar. The O is softer and you want the mortar to be breathable. And so in order to do that, it needs to be a soft mortar. So you want water to come in into the mortar and be able to exit out easily. Remember that mortar is sacrificial. Brick is not sacrificial. You want to save the brick and repair the mortar, obviously because it's in economics. It's cheaper to repair mortar joints than it is to replace bricks that's damaged from spalls, cracks, issues with water infiltration and freezing and thawing. When they crack, it bulges out and then you have an issue with that.